We're here to talk about water, and of course that's the key component of coffee. Without water we wouldn't have very good coffee. I don't think anyway. So what am I here today to talk about? I'm going to talk to you about water resource management. It's largely going to be about water resource management in the Canterbury region. I told Fiona before I prepared the lecture that it would be about water resource management in North Canterbury, and then as I prepared it I changed my mind and I changed it to talk more about water resource management in the central Canterbury area, raising some of the big questions and dealing with some of the areas that we have one or two answers to. I want to give you a little bit of geographical context. I think it's pretty important to know where we are. You're geographers, I'm a geographer by background as well. So here we are, Lincoln University, on the eastern side of the South Island. I'm going to Lake Ellesmere, just sort of south-southeast of the university. In fact, if you stand up on top of the Forbes building, which is just over here, you can see it, which is pretty amazing. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Yellowstone National Park. In fact, other people are going to be talking to you about Yellowstone National Park. Now, I just guessed where it was. I put an arrow somewhere in the US. I think it's roughly right. I haven't been there myself. Love to go there if anyone's got a spare 5,000 to give me. That would actually be really nice. Okay. Well, I guess, and I have to be honest with you, I've taken some of the slides for today's class out of a lecture I give to first year students here. Very, very big class, hundreds of students in it, so Phil's lecture here is 3 times a day. And when I talked to them earlier on this year, I talked a little bit about the tweeting that I have been doing about water resources. Now, I don't know how many people here have Twitter accounts. You can put your hand up. Yeah, 1 or 2. A few of you. You can all follow me on Twitter because I'm world famous and have 70 followers. I got up, yeah, I know. I got up to 73 2 weeks ago, and then some people seem to drop me for some reason. Maybe I was so boring. It could well be the case. So anyway, when I started Twittering, actually I started Twittering about 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and I twittered about my favourite sports, which are rugby and cricket, and no one followed me. So I gave up. I only did 2 tweets. And then earlier on this year, I started tweeting more because I found it quite a good way of learning stuff about the environment from around the world and maybe sharing 1 or 2 ideas. So here's a couple of tweets I did on February the 27th this year. And to me, they're quite important. The second one is probably the one that actually started me thinking about the relevance of the first one. So the second one is about Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere and the role of water races and drains in terms of being really important ecological features, but they're also important geographical features because there's a lattice network of water races and drains across the plains, many of which end up in Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. But it just so happens that because I'm into rivers, and I've been into rivers since I was pretty much this big, no joking, I was pretty much born and bred on the banks of the Rakaia River. So I've been into rivers for a long time, and I found this amazing YouTube clip. And I'm actually going to show you this YouTube clip because it raised with me some real questions about water resource management in New Zealand, globally, and also with regard to Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. And it's entitled, oh, I can't remember what it's titled, but something like Wolves and Rivers. That's what it's called. You're going to see that in a moment. And it begs some questions. What have wolves got to do with rivers? And then you might well say, what have wolves got to do with rivers with Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere when we haven't got any wolves in New Zealand? So I'm just going to leave that in your mind for a moment, and I am going to play this video clip which goes for about 4 minutes. I think we can cope with 4 minutes. It's really good. I love it. You're not allowed to do that.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behaviour of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behaviour of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion, the channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilised the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was a soil erosion because the vegetation stabilised that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, a lot of key words in there, and you're probably all thinking, what have wolves got to do with New Zealand rivers and with Lake Ellesmere? What they have to do with New Zealand rivers and Lake Ellesmere is that they work as a metaphor. So the wolf is a metaphor for what is missing. So what is missing in the way that we manage our water bodies, the way that we manage our lakes, our groundwater resources, to stop them from being depleted or polluted. So the wolf is a metaphor. Literally though, the wolf was what was missing in Yellowstone National Park, wasn't it? Highest trophic food chain, they put it back in there. What did they get? They got all of these things cascading down the food chain, which ultimately led to an improvement in the rivers. So what is the thing or things that are missing when we think about water management in New Zealand? And that's what consumes a lot of what is very little of my spare time. So I have a lot to do with water resource management. I'm on the board of the Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere Trust. I'm on the Hurunui Waiau Water Zone Committee. I'm on the Hamner Conservation Trust. A lot of different organisations that deal with water resource related issues. And we're always thinking about what is missing from our management. What is the wolf in terms of what is missing from this management? So to me, that was a really important signal. And when I found that YouTube clip, I grabbed it myself so that no other university lecturer could use it here. And several have come to me and said, Ken, are you using that YouTube clip? Yes, I am. Don't you dare use it. I found it first because it's that good and I think that powerful. So, what am I going to cover? Well, I think I've already covered quite a bit and I could almost stop now and go and have a nice coffee Fiona. But I'm not going to. I'm going to make you endure. I'm going to make you endure some of the pain that I've gone through in around about 30 years of thinking about water bodies, about thinking about water resource management, and about thinking about Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. So I'm going to try and cover these three things in around about the next 35 or 40 minutes. Why and how people and sort of what reason they use fresh water for on and off farm in New Zealand in relation to Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. I'm going to outline the effects of what people do on those water resources, almost in the same sort of story. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the wolf. What is it that we might be able to do a little bit better that would make water resource management in New Zealand a whole lot more sustainable and our waterways a whole lot less polluted? And I'm going to do it within this geographical context and within a context of thinking a little bit about land use intensification in New Zealand and in particular about irrigation development in Canterbury. So the map on the left is a map of the Environment Canterbury region, your Canterbury Regional Council. So that's our region. It stretches from Kaikoura, way up in the north, down to the Waitaki River in the south and west to the Southern Alps. And over here on the right-hand side, from Carolyn Saunders' work, I've put a map of the potentially irrigable areas. And while the maps aren't exactly the same in terms of scale, what you should be able to see is if you have a look in the central portion of this map, the central Canterbury area that I said I would be talking about, you will see that most of that area is potentially irrigable. That means that most of that area we can cover in dairy cows if that's what we want to do, and we can think about land use sustainability, water resource sustainability, and the water that you drink every day without it having to be treated, which is something that we in Christchurch tend to take for granted. We're one of the few places in the world that you can actually do this. So we think about the Canterbury region, we think about the potentially irrigable area, and we start to think about some questions about the future of water resource management. And then within that context, we think a little bit more about Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere and what makes it tick. And I've put a simple little summary table up here about some of the ecological and geographical and other aspects of Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. It often surprises people to know that it's New Zealand's 5th largest lake by area. There's lots of other bigger lakes, that's because they're a whole lot deeper and contain a whole lot more water. But the 5th largest lake by area staggers a whole lot of people. It's an incredibly windy place. Pretty much blows out there, probably an exaggeration, it doesn't blow there all of the time, but it blows a lot out there. It gets a lot of nor'westers, nor'easters and southerlies. Those winds are really important to the survival of the lake because it's an incredibly nutrient-rich lake, which is the 4th point down there. Its trophic status, it's hypertrophic. If you were hyperactive, and I'm sure none of you are, but if you were hyperactive, then a hypertrophic lake is something that's had too many nutrients. It's like you're having too much sugar. So it's got too many nutrients in it. Because it's hypertrophic, it could die. But the reason it doesn't die is because it blows all the time, which mixes the lake up and mixes it with the air around it and keeps it alive. It's an incredibly biologically diverse lake. No other single site in New Zealand has as many native bird species recorded as does Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. 167 different native bird species that have been recorded there. Nowhere else is even close in this country. So that means not only is it biologically diverse from a bird perspective, it means it must be habitat diverse. So it's got swamps, it's got drier areas, it's got shrublands, it's got a whole host of different microhabitats for different bird species. And of course there's a whole lot of catchment pressures on the lake. And I showed you in that previous map the potentially irrigable area. There is already tens of thousands of hectares intensively farmed in the central Canterbury Plains. The runoff from all of those farms just about goes into Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. That's why those sorts of lakes are described as sinks. You drain the edge of your sink, it goes right to the bottom. The bottom of the Canterbury Plains is Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. That is the sink. That's where all those streams flow into. That's where all the nutrients end up. In terms of its conservation status, and a lot of people don't know this, Te Waihora has an equivalent status to a national park. It has a national water conservation order over it, just as the Rakaia River does, and the Rangitata River and 14 other water bodies in New Zealand. Equivalent of a national park status. That's called a national water conservation order. Most people have no idea it's got that, have no idea how important it is. It really is a jewel in the crown of Canterbury. In terms of Ngāi Tahu, immense value. It's a taonga of absolutely the utmost importance, taonga treasure. It's full of treasures for Ngāi Tahu. And in terms of the different sorts of activities that occur in or around the lake, well, incredible. Recreational fishing, I'm a fly fisher, I've fished there for a very, very long time. Commercial fishing for flounder, for eels, for mullet. Bird watching, yes, I'm a bird watcher, that's what I did my PhD on. Mountain biking, if you've done the rail trail. Boating, farming, customary uses, to name just a few. So not only is it diverse for its bird life, but then when you look at the range of activities, it is one of the most diverse activity-oriented lake that we have in the country. Yet it's incredibly polluted in terms of the nutrients that go into the lake. And the thing that keeps it alive, as I said to you before, is the fact that it's really windy. If it wasn't windy, it would be dead. When I say dead, what that means is the algae the nutrients would all get together, form these incredible algal blooms, which we get anyway, but they would be toxic blooms. And those toxic blooms would kill everything in the lake. So the only thing that really keeps that lake alive is the winds. So we're very lucky. I call it the lucky lake, actually. I give lectures calling it the lucky lake, because really it should be dead because of what we put into it, but the wind and some other features keep it alive. So let's just have a look at a few of those values in a little bit more detail and how they've changed over time. And I know as geographers that maps are the geographer's tool, but graphs are important as well. So I'm just going to show you a few, just one or two graphs about some of the trends that have occurred with regard to some of the values. Now that is not me in that photo, you're not allowed to say that. He's slightly older than me, he's been around a day or two longer. But that family, the Greenslades, still farm around the edge of the lake. Look at that catch that they caught in 1900. Now that's quite a long time ago, 1900. I can't even remember that far back. Hard to believe, isn't it, Fiona and Kay? I can't remember that far back. But boy, would I have loved to have been fishing around there then. So incredible catches of fish. And the Fish and Game Council, which runs recreational fishing in New Zealand and in Canterbury, they've been monitoring trout numbers in the lake since the early 1940s, right through till about this point in time, about 2005, when they've given up. Well, why have they given up? Well, have a look at the graph. There's basically none left. It used to be probably the best, one of the best brown trout fisheries in the world, certainly the best in New Zealand, and now, I won't say it's nothing. In fact, I can go out there and catch really large trout if I want to, and occasionally I do, and friends of mine certainly do, but there's nowhere near the numbers of fish that there used to be in the past. So that's probably the value that is most declined over the years in terms of the lake. Eels, still super abundant in the lake, but not as many as there were in the past. It's New Zealand's biggest single commercial eel fishery. Has been for a long time, still is now. Those are big eels. Yeah, they are big eels. I've seen big eels out there, probably not as big as those, but those are big eels. And I've already told you about the native bird life, the 167 species, the most biodiverse bird habitat in New Zealand. And its importance to customary use. This is a photo taken just a few years ago, 2009, when for the first time in a very long time, Ngāi Tahu were permitted to undertake a customary harvest of black swan eggs. It's really amazing to me, as a Pakeha New Zealander of about 4 or 5 or whatever generations, that Ngāi Tahu would actually have to ask permission of someone else to go and harvest eggs that they used to harvest for hundreds of years. So they had to get permission from Fish and Game and the Department of Conservation to harvest something which was their traditional resource use. I find that bizarre in a country where we have a partnership between our ethnic, cultural heritage of Ngāi Tahu and our introduced cultures like my own. So 2009 was the first time that that's been undertaken for a very long time. And I'm going to show you another graph about the hypertrophic state of the lake. This graph is around an index which is called the Trophic Lake Index. Hardly anyone understands it, so I don't expect you to understand it. What I do expect you to understand, though, is the red line and where that red line sits compared to probably where we would like it to sit. Ideally, we would be liking it to sit between the 4 and 5. That's really where Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere should be. But it's not, is it? It's clearly up in the hypertrophic area, and it's looking like it's going to stay in the hypertrophic area. It's hard to think how we can increase the cow numbers and keep on increasing the cow numbers and not have it up in that yellow area. I believe it's impossible to get it down much further than it is at the moment. But that's not saying the lake's going to die. I've already told you, it's not going to die because it's windy. And those values will in the main be sustained. But you can see also that it is really pretty much fixed in that hypertrophic sort of area. So if we have a look at the range of values that are present in the lake, what is the state of those values? Well, way back in 2007, there was a judge. His name was Judge Smith, and he presides over a court called the Environment Court. And the Environment Court is the court that sits to think about Resource Management Act matters. So if your parents or whoever else, your guardian, decides that they want to develop a subdivision or whatever, build a new building somewhere, they need a building consent, and typically they would also need consents under the Resource Management Act. If those consents are granted, then people can appeal those decisions, and they appeal them to the Environment Court. And Judge Smith sat on the Environment Court, and he listened to some consents that were granted for groundwater abstraction related to the lake. And they visited the lake, he and his fellow commissioners, and they described the lake as in a terrible state. He thought it was disgusting, pretty much, and I can show you quotes around that. The Waihora Ellesmere Trust, of which I'm a member, thought, we're not so sure about this. So in 2007, we commissioned a whole lot of work, and here's the summary of all of that work. And basically, we asked our scientists to report on the health of the lake in relation to sort of a 5-point scale, very good through to very bad. And if you have a look at the values down the left-hand side here, and I use values in quotation marks, then the state of the water, the state of the vegetation, the state of the brown trout fishery, commercial fisheries, wildlife recreation, and the Ngāi Tahu values, then you can see it's a mixed report card. But mostly, and on average, I describe, and I'm going to use another metaphor here, I describe the lake as being more than glass half full. So if you don't understand that metaphor, and some of my international students don't, so I had to explain it to them, it's sort of the way that we look at life. You can be a positive person like Kay and I, and think about things in a positive frame, or you can be all doom and gloom. Everything's a problem. The lake is not everything is a problem. It is not all doom and gloom. In fact, it is the glass more than half full. So if you have a look through those range of values, you'll find that in each there is pretty much some very good, some that's poor, and some that's very bad. But actually, on average, when I look at it all, it's the glass more than half full. So the state of the lake isn't too bad. In fact, it's surprisingly okay for a lake that in theory should probably be dead. The only things that are really bad, and I've already shown you a graph for that, is the brown trout fishery. It's not a gone burger, but it's in a very bad state of health. Now, believe me, there are people here who do not mind that. God, they're introduced fish, Ken. Why would we want introduced fish to be healthy in Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere? Well, they're now a Pakeha sort of tradition. They're things that I like to do. So the brown trout fishery is very bad, but look at all of those others. It's a mix of fair, good and bad. And the only one that stands out otherwise as being bad is the Ngaitahu values. Now I need to lecture you a little bit about that. As a Pakeha New Zealander, I find that embarrassing. I'm an offspring of the Crown. The Crown signed a treaty with Maori New Zealanders to look after their resources. And I'm a multi-generation New Zealander, and look, bad, not good enough, in my view. And I'm not just trying to be a trendy lefty or a trendy whatever. We had a contract. The contract is to look after those resources for Maori. That's what the Queen or whatever representative signed. We can't do it. To me, bad news. My job is to try and fix that. And I think I am starting to make a difference. Look at the rest of them though. Not too bad, are they? The native vegetation, very good to poor. Yes, there's some issues around introduced weed species like willows. Yes, willows are a weed species and bad news in many places. But most of the others, the commercial fisheries, good to bad. Wildlife, very good to bad. 167 species. Only one species is in the bad class, and that's the Australasian bittern. And that's because we've destroyed a lot of its habitat. So overall, not too bad. Let's have a look at the main causes of the bad states. So the few situations where they're bad are on the right-hand side. And what are the main causes that we can see there? Well, it's a mix of causes, but quite a few are related to habitat loss and land use intensification. And land use intensification is typically around farming, but it's also about urban subdivision, urban growth. Selwyn is the fastest growing district in New Zealand. So it's not just farming, it's a mix of things, but farming has a really big role to play here, no doubt about it. So on the right-hand side, we can see a range of these issues. They're impacting on what those scores are, which are impacting on those values on the left-hand side. More recently than 2007, in 2013, we updated our State of the Lake report. You can find this report on our Waihora Ellesmere Trust website. I'll see what my links are doing here. And I think this is a neat report for students to look at. I should, because I'm one of the authors. But I think it's a good report for students to be able to use as a resource. As a resource, because when you actually do have a look at it, what's it doing, Kay? Not a lot. It worked the other day. Oh look, trust me. Cancel. What if I go cancel? Whatever, doesn't matter. Worked the other day. If you go into the www.wet.org.nz website, you'll find this report, and what you'll find is there's 10 individual chapters to the report, and they're only about 2 pages long each. So you can find out just about all you need to know about commercial fisheries, or native wildlife, or vegetation, or farming, or whatever, in a 2-page summary against a core set of indicators, as we call them, about the state of the lake and its environs. And it's a really good resource for students and others to be able to use. What we found, though, was that comparing 2013 with 2007, nothing had got worse, a couple of things have got better. So what that indicates to us is that the management that we're now starting to do regarding the lake and its environs, or the edge areas of the lake, is starting to make a difference in terms of that value set that we were looking So, let's move on to the last of the aims that I listed at the beginning. I sort of described the lake, described the values in their state, and then I said I'd have a bit of a look at what we might be able to do a bit differently that might make things work for the better. Well, something that is happening, every single farm in the catchment of Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere has to have a farm environment plan. Now, there are a very large number of farms, many hundreds of farms within the catchment of Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. Every single farm by 2017 will need a farm environment plan. What that will need to contain, amongst other things, is a nutrient management plan. And I talked about land use intensification. A nutrient management plan means a plan that deals with the amount of nitrogen and the amount of phosphorus that the farm is producing and leaking, as we call it, into our waterways. So the farm environment plan will need a nutrient management plan. We teach nutrient management to our soil science students. Our soil science students will be the sorts of graduates who will go out there and help farmers with their farm environment plans. Another part of those farm environment plans, and I was up in Colbert last night at the Huronui Waia Water Zone Committee meeting, and we were dealing with a Muri irrigation company. It's the biggest community irrigation scheme in North Canterbury. It's got about 60 or 70 dairy farmers in it. They're producing their environmental management strategy. Their environmental management strategy requires every one of their farmers to have an FEP, a farm environment plan, everyone to have a nutrient management plan, and all of them just about also have something to say about the protection of native plants, the edges of native streams, wetlands and the like. So a native plant protection plan. So there will be a whole lot of components. If we all drew up those plans, that would be a tick in the box. That's all it would be. Because I've got lots of plans sitting in my desk, and I ask people, sitting on my desk, and I ask people what they've done with them. Well, we've got a plan. Good. It's like a recipe. I've got a recipe, but did you cook the cake? Oh no, it was all too complicated. So not only do we need to actually make these plans, we have to implement them. And that's one of the big jobs that Environment Canterbury, the Water Zone committees, and researchers like myself have to do, is look at what farmers and other land users are doing, not just in writing up the plans, but in terms of implementing those plans as well. All streams must be fenced off to remove cows and cattle. Now, some people will say to me, Ken, what is the difference between a cow and a kettle? Well, there is no such thing as a kettle. A kettle is something you put water in, isn't it? So, cows and cattle. You see, we talk about dirty dairying, and that's the sort of catch cry that's been out there for over a decade. But in fact, when I go fishing in my secret fishing spots up in the hills, I see cattle. Not cows, I see cattles. Kettles. I see these things grazing on the edges of the river and making my water body that I'm fishing in filthy dirty. And they're not dairy cows, they're cattle. So I think we need to be careful, not just to blame dairy farmers. Urban people, dairy farmers, horticulturalists, that's what my parents used to do. And a whole lot of other people are all in this together. We all have to buy into ownership of wanting clean water for New Zealand. So we need to fence these streams off and remove the cows and cattle away from the edges. And the remaining wetlands need to be protected and restored because we have less than 10% of what we originally had left. If we do all of those things and implement them properly, then because I'm a glass half full person, I'm quietly confident, although I'm sounding quite noisy at the moment, I'm quietly confident that we can do something about water quality in New Zealand. Now, mindful of the time, I tweeted this morning about a speech that the CEO of Landcorp, it's basically it's not a government department, it's a government entity that manages a whole bunch of farms on behalf of New Zealanders, I think about 140 farms, what he had to say about the future of water quality management in New Zealand, and he was extremely pessimistic, really pessimistic. He doesn't think we can actually manage the nitrogen pollution that's going into our water bodies. Now I'm more confident, but who am I to argue with the CEO of a company that runs around 140 farms in New Zealand, and these are big farms. They return to the New Zealand government between $15 and $30 million per year in terms of revenue. If they're pessimistic, why shouldn't I be? Well, I'm the glass half full person. I think if we do all of these sorts of things, at least we can make a start. Okay, summary, key points, maybe hopefully some questions after that. The lake, Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere, has an incredible range of values associated with it, and they're immensely important to a diverse range of people. And I respect that importance, and that importance is important for me to try and sustain. The health of the lake, yes, it's a wee bit mixed, no doubt about it. Many of the values, though, are quite healthy, as I showed you in that table, with a few exceptions as part of it. But it is far from the lake that is dead that some politicians described it as in around about 2006 and 2007. The main pressure or causes of damage to the lake, no doubt about it, is land use intensification associated pretty much with our agricultural practices in New Zealand. And more irrigation, and there's going to be 60,000 hectares of more irrigation just within a few years, there's no question in my mind that there will be more nutrient inputs to the lake, and we need to think how we're going to manage them and sustain, and if we can, actually improve on those values. So I think that's a big challenge. Likely to worsen, I say there, but I still think there's some ways that we can mitigate that and in fact try and sustain the values. How do we do that? Well, we have these farm environment plans, not just sitting on this table or worse, up the back of a wardrobe gathering dust, in fact being implemented by farmers, farm managers, Fonterra, Sinlay, and a whole bunch of other companies out there to make sure that our farmers are operating at what we call best practice. They need to be operating at best practice. Indeed, they need to be beyond best practice. If they can do that, I am confident that we can make a difference. So, what is the future for the lake? Is it a positive one? Well, literally, it is about a $50 million question. And where do you think that $50 million has come from? Well, 2 years ago, the Minister for the Environment at the time, the Honourable Nick Smith, invested in a variety of ways, $6 million from the government, $4 million from a bunch of other parties, and even some money and time from Lincoln University, $12 million into restoration of Te Waihora Lake Ellesmere. It's likely, and look for this space, that before the election, the Minister for the Environment, who's the local MP for the Selwyn area, I would suspect will announce further investments into the restoration of New Zealand's 5th largest lake by area and one of its most important in terms of values, and it may well be a $50 million investment. I don't know. What I do know is that a lot of the impacts that we've had will take a long time to change, and they probably won't change in my lifetime, but hopefully they will change and improve in yours. So I'm going to leave it at that, Fiona. I'm only too happy to try and answer any questions. Thank you. Don't be shy. I'm not.
One of the things we did talk about when we were out.
My PhD on the bird life of the Rakaia River and the Ashley Rivers, and I was really interested in what happens to the flow regime if you take a whole lot of water out, or if you put a dam on a river, or you do a whole bunch of things. And one of the issues that we really are concerned about is if I look at, so here on the y-axis I have the amount of flow, and here on the x-axis I have time, and the hydrograph is going up and down like this. Big flood, it goes up, and then it goes down. And if we take out the little small freshes, so there's a bit of rain, fresh comes up, if we suck those out over time, then we get big flood, flat line, flat line, flat line, particularly in months like January, February, March, April, when we don't have a lot of heavy rainfall in the Southern Alps, we get this flatlining occur. Flatlining causes algal buildup, and you might think, so a bit of green algae. Well, green algae isn't good for a whole bunch of reasons. It's not good if you're a salmon or trout fisher, and I am both of those. It's not good if you're a swimmer and you don't like that horrible algae called didymo. Do you know what didymo is? It's called rock. I'm not allowed to say it anymore. Can I? Rock snot. Okay, so rock snot is a didymo. So didymo is a nasty algae that's invaded New Zealand, and particularly, only in the South Island actually, which is really interesting. Invaded South Island rivers. So flatlining encourages the build-up of algae. So anglers don't like it, swimmers don't like it, aquatic invertebrates don't like it, a whole bunch of other things don't. Even irrigators don't like it, and neither do hydroelectric power schemes, because it drifts into their turbines, into the filters and other things that they've got that to try and stop trout getting onto paddocks through irrigation schemes. So flatlining basically is bad for everyone. The way of managing flatlining is for an irrigation scheme like Central Plains Water to get their water from somewhere other than just the river. So, okay, how can you get water from somewhere other than a river? Well, there's underground, and they're already doing that. Or you store some water outside of the main river. And Central Plains Water has been able to access that water. That's called Lake Coleridge. So water will come from Lake Coleridge down the Rakaia, then be sucked out, and at the same time the freshers will come down and they will be maintained, thus stopping the flatlining that will occur in some other rivers like the Waitaki. So I think Central Plains Water is quite lucky because it's got Lake Coleridge and truss power to work with to get some water from, which will actually help prevent those tables forming and flatlining occurring. Is that okay? I love flatlining. It's a horrible thing. Don't be shy.